patterning back into childhood, back to the things that I was aware of growing up. I think it's a mixture of nostalgia, but also being a female child of the 50s. That division between the home, mum's territory and dad's shed. So I suppose aspect of self was given sewing needles, knitting needles, making things to be useful, ironing handkerchiefs. And the handkerchiefs were not floral either. It was very much that grid of tartan pattern or check variations. Same with the tablecloths. So there were a lot of straight lines. We did sewing at school. The boys did woodwork, which would have been preferable. So you were stuck with a bad lot. But then at the same time, it was interesting seeing a flat piece of material transform into a three-dimensional form, like tartan skirt or a gingham. It was very easy to pleat those because, and they were almost asking to be pleated because they had all that linear structure. It was interesting watching that pattern squish up and sometimes didn't look like squares at all. And some of my earlier pots, I think I mimicked that gingham, well not even earlier, even I still do it, that gridding thing, but it blurs again, emerges. The grid for me is back to childhood. We have fly screens and then the tapestry needlepoint canvas, which was a big part of my childhood, watching old aunties sitting around needlepointing. And my grandmother used to do the cross-stitch aprons because she went to her local CWA branch. She was very proud of her skill with the cross-stitch because within the cross-stitch there are cross-stitches and cross-stitches. And some people are very neat and tidy, and that was to be the goal, not, you know, loose thread or... So tension's very important, and I think that sort of rolls back to tension in my pots that I make, squeezing that clay and compacting it. And I think referencing, sometimes I feel like the knitting, you know, the mum's knitting, where she had good tension. But tension's also a metaphor for one's inner tension as well. So there's that play back into the unconscious, conscious. Painting on canvas, I mean, it is a fabric. You start off with it, the warp and the weft, and filling in, you know, that space in between. Each brush strokes a bit like a stitch. You know, the brush is the needle, the paint is the thread. Sometimes even painting those little lines remind me of very fine coloured wires that I would find in my father's shed. I went to art school a few times. When I went back the last time, I seriously saw myself as a landscape painter. And I went and I never did another landscape painting. I still think maybe it will come where I'll completely just immerse into the paint. My work changes, moves around. Like when I was painting, and then I got into such a tight corner and I stopped and I went to a hobby class and made my first pinch pot. And I found that the clay had a nice therapeutic feeling. It was something I hadn't used before and it was challenging. Sometimes at the end of a bigger piece of work I might have a piece of clay left, say, you know, and I think bit like when you're a kid with the scondo, you just play around. It's that aspect of play afterwards. You're sort of just sitting around, back to child. Some of these, I find these little pots that I have made afterwards, I think they're really nice, but maybe it's because that play just starts to intuitively come into being. You're not making a pot, you're just playing. So the clay is something like going into unknown territory. It's like going to another country. And everything I did with it was a surprise for myself. And then it just took over. I suppose maybe it was a clean page in a way. And it was just the material itself that dominated what I would make. I think it was like building forms. These pots being coil pot, they are linear. They build from a linear form. This pot, as I was coiling around, I was smoothing, as I was showing you when I was making that little one. And then I got to that point, and then I decided to expose the inner side of the coiling, which was a bit like knitting. And then with the patterning, I found bracken kind of fern shapes, you can see here, and some little leaves which I pressed in to the clay. And then over here in this area, these are gum nuts that are slightly open and pressing in, and then they form these little floralette patterns. With this pot, I think I went from the rectangular base and built it up, probably thinking a bit like a packet of coffee when you open it out, and then coming up, building the form, and then getting to a point where it started to round off, but it was pulling it back and pleating in edges. Sometimes I finished them with a pair of scissors, just snipping. Again, it feels a bit like the dressmaker, the sewing technique. I don't ever really know quite what I'm making until I've finished. The plan is just to do it, and I work it out as I go. I tend not to plan. Everything I do seems to just come as I go. I haven't used glazes so far in my work because glaze kind of means something else, bigger choices or whatever. So yeah, maybe these things are treating them like three-dimensional paintings. I have done a lot of still life paintings when I was in Brisbane or whatever, things linked to it. And then I found myself when I was doing this one, seeing, you know, a bottle within that shape. I think that referenced a cup. So it was sort of like, at that point I thought, oh, you could have a line of these kind of pots, but when they line up, you're looking at a painting. Where I want to go with it now, I think I just want to keep going on an open road, I suppose. And I want to break new ground. Some of these white pots here, there were a lot of them that came, and that was after going to Canalda Cave on the Nullarbor Plains with an archaeologist friend. We all had to have lamps on our heads, so you could only see what was in front of you, and probably that sort of was an inspiration, and that sort of completely removed from any of that past stuff. It was about where I am now. I've been to the Philippines a couple of times, being with the Filipino guys that are ceramicists. They wood fire. When I had done them, this clay was just a really dull, like lead pencil grey, dirty thing. And so when he bought his pots, I thought, oh, who did them? Because I'd forgotten about them, and I thought, oh, I quite like them. Sometimes I need a few years in between my work, which is nice when I go back to Brisbane or Melbourne, where I have lived at different times, and you see work that you did do, and you think, oh, who did that? That's really nice. And then you think, oh, that's one of mine. Forgot about it. So it's sort of like you need that, sometimes you need distance.